So in chapter 20, we'll be looking at World War II, and the Great War, or World War I, had demonstrated levels of man-made destruction and devastation that had never been seen before. And there were many people who were hopeful for world peace with the League of Nations that had been created by Wilson. Interestingly, that the United States did not join. But there was a guy named John Maynard Keynes. He was a British economist, and he wrote in 1920, The Economic Consequences of Peace. And his argument was that the Paris peace treaties would push Germany and Austria into starvation. And he blamed the leaders of the Big Three for making such short-sighted demands. And he warned that starving people, quote, in their distress, may overturn the remnants of organization and submerge civilization itself in their attempts to satisfy desperately the overwhelming needs of the individual. And 10 years later, the worldwide depression confirmed Keynes' fears. And so the first half of the 20th century had been the most violent in history because of the cause and effect relationship between World War I and World War II, including the global depression. And despite the League of Nations and despite the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which was signed by 15 nations saying that war was not an option for them, optimism proved futile. There were three major powers in the 1930s and 40s that chose fascist governments: Germany, Italy, and Japan. And all three of them were successful in turning their nations into war machines. So the rise of fascism. Desperate times call for desperate measures. And a good example of that is the communist takeover in the Soviet Union. The word fascism comes from the Latin word fasces, I'm not sure that's an S, but it means, or it refers to, a bundle of sticks carried by officials in ancient Rome as a power symbol. And fascism, this was the point of fascism. It was national power, and fascism exalted the nation over the individual. Anything for the nation. It called for a centralized autocratic government, often in alliance with major business leaders and industry leaders, with tight control over the economy and social life. And they would have a paramilitary organization that would monitor and brutally stamp out opposition in the streets. Fascists in general glorified warfare and vested the power of the nation in one leader. And this was true in Italy, Germany, and Japan. But we're starting with Italy. So even though Italy was a World War I victor, they suffered loss as a result of the war. Like everyone else, they lost people, they lost property, they were influenced by the Depression and general unrest after the war. And so there were labor strikes, there was peasant unrest that spread. People were simply unable to pay their rents. So the government that was elected in 1919 and 1921 were unable to deal with that unrest. And so Mussolini therefore gathered former soldiers. He dressed them in black shirts, and these were his core supporters, and they were called the Black Shirts. And so after Mussolini only won 7% of the vote, the Black Shirts killed 3,000 people in the streets from 1920 to 1922. And so Mussolini declared that the nation was in chaos, and he declared a march on Rome in 1922 and threatened to go in and overtake the government. And so the king, Victor Emmanuel III, asked Mussolini to govern for 1 year as prime minister. And so in 1924, through fraud, through intimidation, through violence, Mussolini took 60% of the vote. And he took control of the state. He abolished all other political parties. He forbid striking. He forbid labor unions. And he censored the press, meaning he was watching over what they were saying, and again, using the black shirts to stamp out any opposition to him. And so he effectively took control of the economy. He regulated wages and prices and working conditions, and industrial policies. In 1935 and 1936, he also attacked and conquered Ethiopia in Africa. And so the League of Nations reprimanded him, and he withdrew from the League of Nations, saying, "Great nations should have colonies." Hitler rises in Germany. So Adolf Hitler had actually admired Mussolini's fascism and Mussolini's rise to power in Italy. Hitler was born in Austria. He dropped out of school at 16. He moved to Vienna at 19 and pretty much supported himself with odd jobs, mainly painting pictures. And he found in Vienna that there was a lot of people that he didn't like. He was offended by wealthy aristocrats. He was offended by socialist workers, offended by Jews who had assimilated into society and often had held high positions in business and other professions. And it was in Vienna that he became a racist. And he exalted the, quote, pure German race. And Hitler, as it turned out, felt more at home in Munich, Germany, where he moved in 1913. He volunteered for World War I. He was just a dispatch runner, but he enjoyed the war and he loved being a part of the German army. And so after the war was over, he fought communism that was spreading among the working classes. And then in 1919, a year after the war was over, Hitler became the head of the anti-communist German Workers' Party, and he turned it into the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or Nazi for short. And in German, again, that's short for National Socialist German Workers' Party. And so following Mussolini's model, he raised up a group of stormtroopers called the SA. And they were a paramilitary group like the Black Shirts that attacked opposition in the streets. And there were actually many people who preferred this type of military organization and the order that it brought to Germany, as opposed to the Weimar Republic, which at this point was really weak. And the Weimar Republic seemed weak both to communists and fascists. Most people preferred fascism to communism, so many people sided with fascism as it was a lesser of two evils. But just a note, again, the Weimar Republic is what succeeded the monarchy after World War I. And this was a democratically elected government of working and middle class membership. But everyone saw this government as too weak, and they either preferred socialism or communism with a strong, centralized, autocratic government. So 1923 was a tough year for Germany, and I just want to go through some of the things that happened in that year. For one thing, the Treaty of Versailles had placed heavy reparations on Germany. It was like 132 billion gold marks or something like that. And their yearly payments were ridiculously steep. They made the first payment in 1921. 1922 came, they couldn't pay it. And so they couldn't keep up with the reparations. So as a result of that, France seized the Ruhr district. This is the heartland of Germany, the industrial part of Germany, and this provoked outrage. Not to mention, in 1923, this caused extraordinary inflation. And part of that was because the people in the Ruhr Valley just stopped working. Like as a protest to France being there, they just passively protested by striking. And so inflation resulted. It wiped out middle class savings. People who had been thrifty all their lives put everything they had into savings. It was now worth nothing because of inflation. And so there were impoverished workers and an unstable government. And so in 1923, Hitler unsuccessfully attempted to overthrow the government, and he was thrown in prison for 9 months where he wrote Mein Kampf. And this was his political manifesto where he denounced the government. He had plans for Germany's greatness. Basically, he laid out his plan for a socialist revolution and the subordination of Eastern Europe to Germany. Also, bitter anti-Semitism. So, France withdrew from the Ruhr Valley and Reparations were eventually rescheduled to make them less burdensome. And basically, the Dawes Plan was what rescheduled the reparations. It said that their amount of payment each year would be based on how well Germany was doing economically. So that relieved that pressure. Well, in 1929, the Great Depression sent Germany back into a state of poverty. And everyone blamed the German democracy for this, the Weimar Republic, even though this was really an international phenomenon, not really the responsibility of any one government. And of course, during this time, Hitler's voice was the strongest in opposition. And so from 1928 to 1932, the Nazi seats in the Reichstag, or their parliament, went from 2% to 46%. And so in 1933, just a year later, Hitler legally was elected as the Chancellor of Germany by his supporters and by those who feared communism. And again, they thought that socialism was a lesser of two evils. So Hitler held another election that year so that he could rule without a coalition. And by intimidation from the SA, his paramilitary group, a majority of the Reichstag voted to make him dictator. And so once that happened, Hitler quickly established a totalitarian state. He controlled the economy, he controlled politics, he controlled culture and art and media, pretty much everything. And so as Mussolini had called himself Duce, or D-U-C-E, Hitler called himself Führer, or leader. And so the SS, established by Hitler in 1925 as a subordinate to the SA, became prominent. And this is another paramilitary organization in black uniforms. All other political parties abolished. June 30th, 1934, there was what has been called the Night of the Long Knives, where Hitler and the SS, another paramilitary group, murdered leading Nazis who would threaten his leadership. And so they were either killed or thrown into a concentration camp. Hitler then established the Gestapo. And the Gestapo was the secret police. They looked for any opposition and took care of it. And so the churches were forbidden to criticize the government. They were encouraged to cut ties with overseas branches of their denominations. So like the Catholic churches in Germany were asked to cut ties with Rome. Protestant churches asked to cut ties with other Protestant churches. And they were encouraged to worship pre-Christian Teutonic gods or German mythology gods. Strikes were forbidden. Employees were granted new powers in dealing with workers. Jews were dismissed from public offices, from universities, from civil service in general. And there was bogus science or radical science that proved that Aryans were the highest race and that Jews were the lowest race. And again, I say bogus science. This is when people began to flee Germany, including Nobel Prize winners like Fritz Haber and Albert Einstein. They pretty much saw where this was going for the Jewish people. There was a guy named Joseph Goebbels, and I'll put his name up here. And he was in charge of indoctrinating the nation with his Nazi propaganda. And so Hitler set the nation to work on programs of public works, housing, superhighways, draining swamps, reforestation, all of that. And he introduced state planning. Unlike the Soviet Union, though, he worked within the framework of private property. He didn't confiscate everyone's property. Hitler did violate the Paris Peace Accords and began to rebuild the military. According to the Treaty of Versailles, they were supposed to reduce the size of their military dramatically, which again, he began building back up. And he also signed the Anti-Comintern Pact. And this agreed mutual support against the USSR. So Japan between World War I and World War II. So during the Meiji Restoration, before World War I, Japan had rapidly reorganized the government and the economy along Western lines, pretty much. They had modernized. And they even reversed the teacher-student relationship in China, defeating China and Korea in 1895. And so they became the dominant nation in East Asia over China, who had formerly dominated. And so after World War I, Japan was assigned control over Germany's Eastern Pacific colonies. In Japan, between 1914 and 1919, manufacturing, transportation, and exports increased dramatically. And one thing that Japan had was a dual economy. And there were two sectors in this economy. One sector consisting of a large, highly capitalized, advanced factory system that engaged in mass production, and another sector that included small-scale workshops. And those two things, which in many other places the factory system canceled out the small-scale workshop, but in Japan it worked alongside each other, and they made their two sectors interdependent and complementary. But in 1918, Japan was affected by poor harvests, which caused a sharp increase in the price of rice, which is a Japanese staple. And so massive riots broke out. There were 25,000 arrests, 1,000 people dead over the rioting. And so the government responded by importing rice from Korea and Taiwan, reminding Japan, though, of their dependence on their colonies. In the 1920s, industrial production increased by 66%, and the Zaibatsu came to control much of the Japanese economy, and they were influential in politics. The Zaibatsu refers to the industrial and financial business leaders in the empire. And I'll put that up here. There you go. So the four largest were controlled by individual families: Mitsubishi, Mitsuo, Yasuda, and Sumitomo. Each of those operated a bank and numerous industries. So they were these massive, economically influential families in Japan. It looked like Japan was going to embrace some liberal theology because they passed the Major Industries Control Law of 1931. And this encouraged the cartels, or these industry leaders, to negotiate prices and wages. Not to mention, they had universal male suffrage, a growing level of wealth, rising urbanization, high literacy rates. But the Zaibatsu and the military were incredibly powerful. And supposedly the power rested in the emperor, but historians still debate who dominated the politics during this period. Many of the samurai military elites were also beginning to claim expanded powers for the armed forces. And so 1929 comes, and the Depression rocked the Japanese economy just like it did everyone else, and the value of exports dropped 50%. Unemployment rose to 3 million people, and generals increasingly gained control of the state and turned toward military goals. And so, as happened in Germany and Italy, there were fascist elements to Japan, but they used the military to take control of the government. In other words, there were lots of beatings, murders, expansion of aggressive foreign policy through the military instead of a dictator, at first anyway. So we'll go ahead and end there, and we'll pick up in the next video with the descent toward war.